conversations about death and dying. And I'm here with my friends and colleagues,
Red Keating,
David Kennedy,
and I'm Julie Brown here at Hospice Peterborough. Just as we begin, I just wanted to give a particular shout out to David Kennedy, who is newly retired from Hospice Peterborough. And David, just want to say we're so happy and grateful and delighted that you're going to continue with these podcasts with us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So today's podcast, we're going to talk about grieving and the grief journey. And I think the three of us felt that this was a really important topic that we do an episode on very early on in this series. And let's talk about a little around why we wanted to bring this topic forward.
Well, one of the things that I have always recognized is the fact that there are consequences to how we function and what we do. And the consequence, as we've been talking about in the first three podcasts, around the culture's avoidance of death, when we don't deal with death, then grief becomes a crisis in many ways, and not necessarily a crisis, but certainly a conundrum, and people don't know what to do with it. So it's a natural flow out of that problem that we have with looking at death and understanding it and talking about it.
Right, and so you had said, when we shut down conversations about death, we're shutting down conversations and feeling and all of that work around grief as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And as we spoke earlier, that sense of ritual too. Different cultures will have sort of expected behavior post death. And they're respected, and it's understood that this is something that people are now in a new state of being. They're still here in this world, they're alive, but they're also in a different state. And we respect that, and we acknowledge that, and it's very clear to those around them what state they're in. And so, like you said, once you remove the whole process of dying, then you remove the process of how do I cope living with that death.
The other piece I think that we've talked about too is that death has been totally medicalized in so many ways, and so if that's your understanding of death and dying, then grief becomes medicalized, and so and we've all experienced that some of the first responses to grief are pharmaceutical responses and medicalized responses, and so if that's the approach, then we really haven't room for people to understand and to make it not a pathological response.
And I know that's something that all three of us feel really strongly about is what we would call depathologizing grief, that it's not a disease or a condition or a disorder. And it reminds me of one of my favorite quotes by a Jewish rabbi, Earl Groman, who says, "Grief is not a disorder, a disease, or a sign of weakness. It is an emotional, physical, and spiritual necessity. The price you pay for love. The only cure for grief is to grieve." And I quote that a lot to people because I love that opening. It's not a disorder. It's not a disease. Nothing is wrong with you when you are grieving, even though the feelings, the sensations, the thoughts, the experience can feel very wrong, very hard, very painful.
I think the feeling side of it confuses things, because if it was a medicalized situation, if I had had an amputation or if I had had some really serious surgery, I would give myself the time to recover, to heal, to get back, get back to an equalized state. I may even have physiotherapy, to get myself back, and I would give myself that time. I would be kinder to myself, I think, if it was physical, but because it's emotional. We sometimes don't know what to do with it, and we think maybe there's something wrong with us because we are maybe struggling to feel like we are capable, competent, in control, and instead we feel like we might be just sort of emotionally frayed and at loose ends, and that's really uncomfortable for us and uncomfortable for the people around us as well.
We're also a culture that we've talked about that is so committed to acquiring things that we don't pay attention to when we lose things, right? That loss of whether it's even the physical amputation requires some aspect of grief, emotional response to it. But again, that gets pushed aside, and we just kind of think it's only a physical response. So I think there's a whole dynamic of things that are at work here that really make people have a difficult time with taking time to deal with their grief.
You know, and on that idea, and I know I've said this before, but I feel like we really live in this emotion-phobic society. I mean, we're okay with certain emotions, right? But when it comes to emotions like, you know, sadness, pain, or suffering, disappointment, you know, confusion, panic, overwhelm, all of those things, we just don't know what to do with those things. And what's really interesting about grief is that often in the first few days or week or two, when we expect for people to be, often there's a perception that that's when people will be in their emotional pain. But as we know, people are often in shock at that point, and we see that all the time. And you know, and then there's those comments, oh, she's doing so well, she's so strong, oh, he seems okay. And then when we see people here at hospice is often when some of that numbing effect is starting to go away, and they're starting to have these big, overwhelming feelings, and that's when they think something is wrong. And of course, so much of our work is telling them, is normalizing all of that, and making sure that, you know, we're giving lots of messages around it feels wrong because it's so painful, but it's not wrong.
I often explain to people that grief takes up so much space.
It does.
And not just space in us, in our world who are grievers, but space around. And when people around us do not allow us the space to be in our grief, then that's, again, where we feel the pressure that something's wrong with me and I need, you know, that I need to get this fixed. But it takes a lot of space.
And I think inside that space, sometimes we search for what's the prescription. What you know, if I can take a pill for my physical pain, what's the prescription for my emotional distress? What's the prescription for my emotional pain? And there isn't necessarily one if you're staying away from pharmaceuticals. And then that also makes us uncomfortable because where's the way through this? I don't have maybe a clear path. I can't see where this ends. And that becomes really difficult because it's like, how do you enter a journey that you don't see the end, and you don't see what's between now and the end, and where the twists and turns are? It is like being lost.
But there's no shortcut. And that's the other, you know, I keep saying to people, there is no shortcut. You need to sit with this.
Yeah.
And that's scary. Because we feel like it will never end. Like you said, right, we don't see the end. But that's not true. Yeah. But you have to sit with it.
It takes a certain amount of trust.
Oh my gosh.
It's a real lack of control, right? Yeah. Which is really, you know, death is about teaching us, you know, being diagnosed with a life-threatening illness, you know, the process of dying, death, grief. I mean, that is so much of what it's teaching us, is that we really don't have the control that we like to move around through our lives thinking that we have. And I often say that to people, you know, your control is an illusion, and there's nothing like death and grief that is a teacher of that. But when we're in that place, and it, as you say, Red, like, we don't see the pathway through, we don't know when it's going to end, all of that ambiguity and uncertainty just adds to the already scariness of those big feelings and experiences.
And one of the things, and you're absolutely right, Julie, about the loss of control, and I think that's what creates that whole ethos. But in encouraging people to find some control, I think it's important to distinguish some of the terms, for instance. And the way I do it is that we have these three words. We have bereavement, we have grief, and we have mourning. And sometimes people use those interchangeably, but I think it's really important that we understand the distinctions. That bereavement is this overarching banner, if you like, that expresses somebody who has experienced some kind of loss. So whether that's even a physical or a death or what relational, you're in a state of bereavement. Grief is what happens to you, and you don't get to choose what that is, and that's that loss of control piece. We don't have control over how this death impacts me. And we know that grief is unique to everybody. So I don't have control over what that does in me. The only control that I could possibly have is in the mourning. And the mourning is, what do I express outwardly around my grief that has happened to me. So I like to encourage people to find the control piece, because I think that's helpful. But the control piece is not in the grief. That's where you have to sit with it. The control piece is saying, okay, what am I going to do? What can I do? And that's, we're back to the ritual, perhaps. We're back to, how do I find a way to express what I am feeling? Or how do I express what this means to me? So those are the control pieces that I think are good to look for. But if you're trying to find a way to control your grief, that's just not going to happen.
That reminds me, I need go back and correct something I said. Like I think what I said earlier is that there's a beginning, then there's an unknown middle, and that I assumed that there was an end. And I think that's the other piece, is that there isn't necessarily an end.
No.
And it isn't about getting better. It isn't about getting over it. It's about learning how to live life today with the absence of the physical presence of that other person. And how do I do that? How do I live today with the understanding, the knowledge, and the experience of that absence? And there is no end to that, because that absence will be lifelong. And so as we move through, it might get easier in terms of living without the absence might be more comfortable. We might get more used to it, but that doesn't mean that at a certain point, 10, 5, 15 years down the road, 20, 30, that you might experience that person, they come to mind and heart, and you're right back into the feeling of the loss in a way that maybe you hadn't felt for a really long time. And so I think that's the other piece of this that's daunting, is that people want to get over it. What am I supposed to do to get over this? How am I supposed to? And it isn't. It's about learning how to live with the loss. It's about learning how to live with the absence.
And I think, and I know it's already been said, I think we'll probably say it several times, but part of learning to live with it is giving it space, is being with it. And one of the things that I find a lot of, both with the people I've been with and, even in my own grief journey, is we want to leapfrog. It's a normal human reaction to say, like, I'm in pain, therefore something must be wrong. What am I going to do? How do I get rid of this pain? How do I fix it? Or we then turn on ourselves and say, what is wrong with me? What is wrong with me in the way that I'm grieving? What is, how should I be doing this differently? Other people seem to be doing well. Why am I not doing well? So I often find, like, then we start to turn on ourselves. So we layer our pain in that way.
And both of you have brought this piece out, that grief is not just a past experience. Grief is both past and future. And you're right, Red, there is no getting over it. There are ways in which it changes, if we're willing to sit with it. And in my experience, in working with people in grief over many years, is that if we're unwilling to sit with it early, then we're going to have to learn to sit with it later. It doesn't just go with time. So, but grief is past and grief is part of our future. But the way it is in our future doesn't mean it's the way it has been in now. So it's that continuum, if you like.
That's why I love that quote. The only cure for grief is to grieve. Like, it is a necessity. It is a necessity that we do it. And I think of how many times as a therapist somebody's been referred to therapy with me, say by their doctor, and they thought they were coming for whatever reasons happening in their life. But what we end up talking about is that grief from 25 years ago that was never given space, never given its attention.
This is all reminding me, and I wish I could remember the guy's name, but about 25 years ago, I was at a conference, and this guy made the statement that says, you don't get to drive your sports car through the shadow of the valley of death. You've got to walk. It's a walking journey. It's not something that you can just skip over, drive through as fast as you can. He says, and the importance of that is because if you're in your car and you're trying to drive through it too fast, you're missing something that you're supposed to get through the walking. And that the walking and the pace of it is important. And it kind of reminds me of Thomas More's talk about going down into melancholy. If you don't let yourself go down, you're going to miss that little pearl that might be hiding in the mud, at the bottom where you actually needed to go to get yourself back up again. And so that always stuck with me, is that you don't get to drive a sports car through the shadow of the valley of death.
So we don't get to speed through it,
Yeah.
and there's no way to, I use that word leapfrog, because I hear people often wanting, or like, so they'll want to, like, well, I'm going to get to what is the meaning of this, right? Like, I'm going to try to make meaning out of my suffering. Well, you can't get to the meaning until you walk through. You walk.
I really like that. That's a good thought. But
Right.
often because people are hard on themselves, exactly on that, Julie. Sometimes it can be helpful for me to deflect or reframe that a little bit and say, well, don't you think they're worth it? Aren't they worth you? Like, did their life mean so little to you that they die and then a week later you're okay again? Like, do they not deserve a little more than that? And I think it can be helpful if we can have that perspective and, okay, this isn't all about me, this is about the person who died.
Right.
And the relationships that we had, and so they deserve a little more of my time.
Right.
And rather than work wanting you back in 3 days, which one deserves me right now, and looking at it that way.
And that pressure to get over it, to leapfrog, it can also come from outside, right? Of people that might be in your circle, that are friends, acquaintances, family, who are watching your grief and how you're grieving and are uncomfortable and want you to, it's better for them if you would rush through it. If you would just do it right. If you would just not do what you're doing, you would be a whole lot better. And I think really what the person is saying is, I need you to rush through this because it'll make me feel better. Right?
Like, your pain is painful for me.
Right.
So seeing you in distress is really distressing for me. So let's be okay. Hey, let's try to change the subject. Let's go do something. Let's cheer you up.
Yes.
Right?
I don't know how to relate to you in this state.
Right.
It makes me uncomfortable, and so now I don't know how to be with you anymore.
Right.
So just get better so that we can go back to having fun again.
Let's talk about that for a moment. Like, what would be your advice, or what would you tell people about how to be with others who are grieving, so we give their grief that space?
Well, it begins with listening, not with speaking, and that's the hardest part for many of us. Is that, as both of you have commented, we feel we need to advise. Working with grief should never involve advice. It's about listening, and just because that person might need to be doing something that you think, well, why would you need to do that? That's not it really is that, and that's hard. That's hard in our world of even as in our work, when people come to us, they really want us to give them the answer, but we can't begin with that. You begin with listening. And that's the hard piece with being with somebody, especially if they're struggling. To sit, Orion, the dreamkeeper, said, can you sit with somebody who is in suffering without trying to fix it or make it better? Can you just sit with them? It's hard to find people who will do that with you.
I often think of the term bear witness. Can you bear witness to their suffering and say, I'm here with you. I see your suffering. I'm here with you. I care about your suffering. I care about you, but I'm not trying to fix it.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's the space. I mean, when we say give it space, you give it your ear. You give it your ability to listen. You give it your ability to not judge or to criticize what the person is doing. And it's. And I think sometimes what people don't realize is that people can't stay in that state constantly forever.
Yeah.
And so it will ebb and flow. And so, the person might go through a few days and they feel like, hey, I'm feeling fine again. And then something happens which triggers a reaction. And if the person who was journeying with that person just could realize that it isn't always going to be sitting in the grief all the time. There will still be laughter, there will still be stories, there will still be things in sharing. It's just that grief will visit, grief will ebb back in, and then to provide that space, that non-judgmental listening ear that says, I'm journeying with you, even though, and I think it's my sense, I can't do really anything to alleviate this from you. So I feel powerless to help a friend in grief sometimes. That sense of, what can I do to make it better? There's nothing you can do to make it better, but you can sit with me.
Right, and so that's part of that, like, tolerate your distress around that is what you can do, is I see you're in pain, that's hard for me, and I'm going to sit with that distress in myself and be with you.
You always have the good words that say things that I don't know how to say.
The other thing it does is we have to watch our own expectations, and out of our own experiences of how we have responded to grief doesn't necessarily mean that's how other people. For instance, we talk about instrumental grief and intuitive grief. There are some people intuitively where it's very emotional. It's a totally emotional experience. But instrumental grief is where people, they're mourning their grief by doing things. So you might find somebody who, right after the death of somebody significant, goes and decides they're going to paint their house or going to just go crazy cleaning, and people are judgmental about that, saying, "Oh, they're not grieving, they're not mourning," when in fact that is the way in which they're expressing how they need to deal with that at the moment. So I think we have to be listeners. We have to sit with people. We also have to be careful about imposing our own views around what they should be doing and shouldn't be doing. But some of that comes too from, and I don't know when you want to get into it, but our whole culture's way of creating stages of how to do this. So we've kind of found ways to say, oh, you've got to do this, and I know you two are the same way. How many times somebody has come to me and said, well, I'm angry, or so I must be in that stage.
Right. So we're talking about the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, stages that, and I mean, she said so clearly it was never meant to be this linear, here's the stages, you're here now, and it was never. She was just trying to provide some structure.
And it was around dying.
And it was about
grief.
dying. Yeah.
But it's been taken because, it's an easy way to look at it, and you can. We're back into our model of our culture. We want to see the steps to get better, and even educationally, it's a great way for an exam, right? Because you can get either right or wrong.
Right.
And grief is not right or wrong.
Right.
It just is.
Oh, I'm not in denial anymore. Check. Right?
And I think we do that because we're trying to understand a phenomenon, right? And so inevitably, once you give it some sort of written form, and like a prescription, that people look at that and say, oh, there's the prescription, when in fact, like Julia said, it's not linear. It's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It could be all at once. It could be, and I think it's our role to try to say this is a conceptualization, and this is how the academics and people that are studying this have tried to figure it out. But it doesn't mean in reality that you are now supposed to follow this like it was a prescription. This is phenomenon that could happen. Think of Warden's stages. Like what are you doing? What are your tasks? Then that makes tasks. The morning is the work that I need to accomplish, and it's like, well, that's not what that's meant to say either. I don't think but it is just here are some things you might experience as you go through this journey, and we have to unpack all that and sort of disentangle that from the places that it has seemed to solidify in our mind's eye and in our culture.
The way I explain it to people is it's like being strapped to the front car of a roller coaster. You're in for a ride, up and down, back and forth, and just some days you're just hanging on.
Yeah.
Other days it's a pretty good ride.
Yeah.
But I think we do need. I think all of these pieces, whether it's Warden or Schubert or any of them, that are saying, so what are we going to look for to say that we are moving in our grief and our? So I think there's a sense in which we do. Hopefully have some things that we are going to identify that say, okay, there's some healthy movement, but it's not this linear stage. You do this, and then everything's okay.
All tools are useful. It just depends on how you use them. And they can be misused, right?
I think, so many of the people that we support here at hospice often feel, though, that something is wrong, or something is wrong with them in their grieving journey. And a lot of it is, though, normalizing, is bringing this lens to it and saying, just, acknowledging the pain or the suffering or the fatigue. A lot of people forget that grief can be very physically experienced, very cognitively. The memory loss, the lack of focus, a lot of that is just, acknowledging, and that nothing's wrong. We're not trying to push that away. And it's interesting to me, some people need our support, but sometimes it's also that maybe they're not experiencing that elsewhere.
Yeah, and that's why I think groups can be helpful. For instance,
absolutely.
I remember the parent group. That was the one group that I worked with at hospice over the years, and such a powerful group for parents who've had a child die. But I remember they used to say, this is the one group that nobody wants to belong to, but that once you're here, you're glad it's here. And there was a sense every time we connected where I heard them say, I need to be with others who understand me. I need to be with those who I don't have to explain things to. And so I think grief does have a normal sense of needing to find that place of understanding. And even in that group, people did it. The mourning and the grief looked different. But it was that commonality of, I don't have to tell you why I'm feeling this way, and you get it. Yeah.
What about guilt? Guilt is something that comes up a lot in grief, and I just thought maybe we could just take a few moments today just to talk about guilt.
Well, it's ever present. Quite I didn't get to say the last thing that I wanted to say. Our last encounter was maybe not so positive. If there's a lot of if-onlys, a lot of regrets come along with that in terms of the difference between regret and guilt.
Yeah, that's a big one for me.
Yeah.
Regrets are if I'd have known then what I know now, I would have done it differently. And we all have those. You can't be human, can't be a parent, a partner without regret. But regrets regrets for me are based on a love relationship. I wish, if I'd have known you were going to die that day, I'd have done everything to make sure you got the help you needed. Guilt for me is different. Guilt is I knew but I didn't care and I did it on purpose to hurt you. And I've dealt with people who have had guilt. But most of what we experience in people are those regrets. Right. And I can't take those away. I mean, trying to take those things or make people feel better isn't the answer. But the answer is to say, I wish I'd have known. And had I known, I would have done anything. And to allow that space to be there rather than to be continually beating themselves about what they didn't do.
Yeah. And the power of hindsight there, that to beat ourselves up with hindsight, because inevitably what the person will do is in hindsight they'll create a scenario that has a better outcome.
Yeah.
And I always say, but you can't say that's going to be the outcome. If you had known, you would have done this and it would have been better. Well, if you had known, you would have done this and it might not have been better. But we can create with hindsight that sense that if I had done something differently, it would have had a better outcome. And it's never it would have had a worse outcome. And that's as much a fiction as a Stephen King novel. We create that own fiction, which then we use to beat ourselves up with again. Because we paint a rosier picture, and if only we had done something. And that hindsight and beating ourselves up with regret is really common experience, I think. I don't know how helpful it is, but like you said, there's not a lot you can do to rid a person of it.
But sometimes I think that kind of thinking and the guilt and the regret is again feeding back into this need to believe we have more control than we do. Right? Oh, if I don't, I should have done this. I should have done this. I could have controlled this outcome.
Yeah. And when you ask someone, you made the best decision that you could have made in that moment with the information that you had. In any other situation other than this particular death, they kind of go, oh yeah, I get that. And then you put it back, you lay that same rationale and that same thinking over top of the death, and somehow it gets erased. that there's still that expectation that if I had control, if I had more control, if I had done it right, the outcome would be better.
You know, death, as we've already talked about in our previous podcasts, is a normal piece of our life for every one of us. And yet we have really struggled with that same view around grief.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's true. So as we start to bring this podcast episode to a close, I just thought, let's each just take a few moments to maybe share what would we want people, what haven't we covered that we would want people to hear? Maybe someone who's listening to this who's in a place of grief, mourning right now. And I also want to say, as we go into that, when we speak about this, we're speaking about any loss, right? That we've kept referring to death, but also recognizing that there are many losses we have in this life that are not a death, and that are changes. Like David, you just retired, and you mentioned relationship loss. We also lose our pets. Of course, that's a death. But there's, we can lose jobs. This year, pandemic, there's been all these losses. And I also want to acknowledge a loss that often goes not spoken about, which is pregnancy loss also as well, which of course is a death as well.
I think that the greatest thing, and the thing that I could say around grief is simply that, not simply, but we need to sit with it as we've talked about. And we need to find a way to mourn it. We need to find a way to express. And that doesn't have to mean anything to anybody else sometimes. But it's something that we need to do that acknowledges what this relationship, what this person meant to me, and that I will no longer have that person with me the way I have, but that this is important for me to acknowledge and to find a way to express that. And that's not a one-time thing. In early on, I think it's something that we can do. I think there's times when, my parents have been dead for, my mom 2005, my dad 2000. There's times when they come to mind, like you said, that you're never over those. And I have those moments. I have things I do. I have an outward thing that I do to allow me space to spend with them. So I think rather than trying, which is our first response perhaps, is to shut it down, forget about it, get over it, move on. Let's find a way that we can, for the rest of our life, find a healthy way that when we experience those moments, those times of grief, that we can express that and be okay with expressing it.
Mm-hmm. I was going to say something very similar, just echoing back to our references about judgment, that when we're in pain, we often layer our pain by judging ourselves for being in pain, or judging how we're expressing the pain. We get lost in that, like, what's wrong with me? Why am I doing it this way? I should be over it, all of those sort of things. And so, that idea of, can we offer ourselves compassion? That I'm hurting because I'm grieving, and this person meant so much to me, and I'm hurting, period. I'm hurting. Not I'm hurting and something's wrong with me, or the way that I'm doing that. So my piece here, I'd just like to say, is the idea of being compassionate. That compassion that we so freely give to others when they're hurting. Can we turn that compassion back around towards ourselves and say, yes, I'm hurting, and can I be with myself in this really kind and tender way?
Yeah. Well, you guys were talking, in my head, all I could think was, I was just saying, be good to yourself. We talked about allowing space. We talked about listening. Well, we can listen to ourselves. We can allow ourselves that space. And I think that was in my head. I was saying, be good to yourself, and understand that it's all right to be good to yourself. And like you said, we can often show compassion for others, but it's hard to sometimes be compassionate to ourselves. And I think that it's that sense that we are in this as a journey, and it is, again, one of the things that connects us all is that we're all people in this world who have lost somebody who was important, and so we share the same experience. And so it's interesting that we seem so alienated from it, and maybe that's the medicalization. And I think that maybe it's if you could say the emotion is real and you're allowed to have it.
Yeah.
The emotion is real and it connects you to other people. The emotion is real and you don't have to be alone in it, but you can if you want to be for a while. It's yours, and if you can control anything, that's what you can control. Is how you are in your own emotions.
Permission to feel.
Permission to feel. So,
And just a last comment from me is that, often when I in my classes and I teach, I begin with, if anybody can tell me how many people die in Canada per year, and it's something we never think about, right? But roughly it's about 275, 280,000 people, and on average, so if you've got 250,000 people, and on average they say that each one of those represents about 30 close relationships. So you multiply 250,000 times 30. How many people are experiencing grief all around us? And grief tends to isolate us.
It does.
And so we feel like we're the only ones experiencing this, when in fact, everybody we connect with, as you said, Red, we're all part of this journey.
Yeah.
So we're in this, we just don't speak about it. But what would be different if we could?
Yeah.
If we could not feel like I have to do this myself, I can be who I am among people who also are experiencing grief.
And if you ask me about my grief, you're not going to make me any more sad.
Oh.
You know what I mean? I think our fear is, if I ask you about it or we talk about it, I'm going to make you sad. It's like, I'm already sad, and we're ignoring it. So by you not talking about it with me, you're just ignoring this huge part of my life right now. Yeah. And no matter what you say, I can't be sadder than I am right now. So talking about it might actually lift me up a little bit for a while, because it gives me a place to put it. Yeah. It helps me know that someone else is there to hear it, and I have someone carrying it with me for a while. But I think we're so afraid to make somebody feel bad that we don't even breach the subject.
I'm like
trying to get in.
because I so agree with what Red says is, and then people apologize. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't want to make you sad. Well, you're sad.
Yeah.
You didn't make. But what you're
Make you
doing when you ask them that is you're honoring their grief. You're giving them space, and then to follow something like that up with, be curious about that. You can ask them if it was their mother. Ask them something about their mother, or ask them. Mother's Day I know just passed. Father's Day is coming up, and how's that going to be for you? Right?
And speak their name if you know their name. There's nothing. The name is being forgotten is the greatest fear, and so when we use their names, and just in a casual say, I remember when John used to love to do this, or you're right. That's the honoring piece, but that's where we, when people say to me, nobody talks about him anymore. And then when I ask somebody, why don't you? Well, I didn't want to upset them. It's that, and I said, well, there's nothing you could do or say that can upset them more than they already are.
Yeah.
So why don't we just be honest with them? So.
Well, I think, guys, we have a lot to say on this subject, don't we? We've already gone longer than we were going to, which tells me there will probably be a part 2 to this conversation at some point. Thank you. Any final comments?
I'm good.
Okay. Thanks so much for listening.